Hello and welcome to the Tennessee Informer. Well, we had a week off last week, but we're glad to be back and we have a great show lined up for you. This month's shows are brought to you by Jonathan and Mary League of Clarksville, and we greatly appreciate their generous donation. Thank you all for joining us tonight. The name Nathan Bedford Forrest struck fear in the hearts of the Yankee enemy during the War for Southern Independence. But unfortunately, he's now seen by Yankees, communists, and other indoctrinated lowlifes in our society as the epitome of an evil, racist slaveholder, undeserving of even being allowed to rest in peace and not have his grave desecrated. I think he deserves much better, and most Americans used to think so as well. Nathan's birthday was yesterday, Sunday, July the 13th, and today we are going to celebrate his birthday by telling the truth about this great man's exploits during and after the War of Northern Aggression. Nathan Bedford Forrest is one of the greatest Tennesseans that has ever lived and certainly was a much better man than his current detractors. So from everyone here at the Tennessee Informer, happy birthday, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Before we get into the celebrations, first we have another Trump update. The topic of tariffs are back in the news again. The good thing about them is they brought in, since I think towards the end of June or the 1st of June, $27 billion, and that's great. I hope that continues. It very well may, could increase. That's a lot of money, and it's potentially great news. But only if we apply it to the incredible amount of debt we're in, okay? As long as it doesn't just become another funding stream. If it just becomes another funding stream, then that's a seriously wasted opportunity. But I'm glad that we're doing well with that, so hats off to President Trump for his tariffs. President Trump, he's hard to follow. He is really hard to follow. Yes, we are still talking about Epstein, and we'll continue to talk about Epstein. Why wouldn't we? I know most of you are probably up on the whole Epstein thing, and we're like, we've been hearing for months now that more is coming out, they're getting it together, and now Trump is like, oh, we're still talking about this? Why are we talking about this? Why are we wasting time on this? That was just crazy. I don't know what's up. Now, I don't buy the theory that Trump is in the Epstein files. I don't buy that, okay? If he was in the Epstein files, the Dems would have found a way to hang it with him. Even if some of their people were in it, they would have found a way to hang him with that already. So I don't know what's going on, but I'm not buying the line we're getting from the White House, okay? And for him to come out and say, well, this is just a left-wing stunt or whatever he's calling it. Well, when did he find that out? Did he just now find that out? Was that the result of their investigation for the last 5 months? If that's the result, then they should say, okay, hey guys, they fooled us all this time and here's how they did it. I don't think anybody's buying that. So I hope they come clean on this. This is not going to go away, and it really hurts the credibility, in my opinion. Trump is now sending weapons to Ukraine. He says he's upset with Putin, says Putin's real nice guy, but that, he talks nice and then bombs people at night. Well, that still does not make Ukraine our war. And that still does not mean we should be sending them weapons. Now we're going to send them Patriots. Apparently we're going to send it to NATO or the UN, whoever. He said somebody else is paying for it, but we're still sending it to them. That's still depleting our reserves. I'm sure we don't have, a huge number of Patriots. We're going to send them that. And do you think that Russia, since he's announced this to the whole world, they're going to say, oh, well, it didn't come directly from the U.S. to Ukraine. It went to, that's not going to matter. If we were at war with Mexico right now, we're fighting because of the cartels, and Russia gave weapons to Guatemala and told Guatemala, announced it to the world, hey, this is for Mexico. Yeah, I think we would still say, hey, that's from Russia. That's a problem. So I don't know why we're going down this road. I thought, he was right when he said it wasn't our war, it wasn't our fight. I think he's meeting with NATO tonight, so we'll see what comes out of that. Anyway, we do have some good news out there on the economy. I just hope that they use this tariff money to pay down the debt, because guess what? That debt is a huge, huge threat to us, short term and long term. Now to our special guest, Gene Andrews. Here's a little bit about Gene Andrews in case you haven't heard of him, or we had him on the show a couple times before, but just in case you forgot. He was born and raised in Nashville, Tennessee. He played football and ran track in high school, went to college on a trade scholarship at the University of Georgia, track scholarship at the University of Georgia. He served as a first lieutenant with the 3rd Marine Division in Vietnam. Thank you for your service, sir. He played for the Quantico Marines football team back in the States and even had a tryout with the Cincinnati Bengals. He played a couple of years with minor league football teams, and he said we need to really stress the word minor. He taught history and coached football and track in 2 different high schools in Nashville. He worked for his brother Don in a motorsports medical program in IndyCar, NASCAR, and the American Le Mans. He's done this for over 25 years. He retired but works almost full-time as the caretaker for the Nathan Bedford Forrest boyhood home near Chapel Hill, Tennessee. Gene, thank you so much for joining us on our program tonight.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
And how are you doing? You have had a pretty outstanding life there. You've got a lot of experiences.
Well, it wasn't boring. I will say that.
Doesn't sound like it. And I definitely appreciate your service and appreciate the service you're doing now. You mentioned teaching history in your bio. Now, did that include the history you taught? Did that include the misnamed Civil War? Did you cover that when you were teaching history?
We certainly did, and we gave them the facts of why that war was brought down upon us in the South. It really, the slavery was the emotional issue, but just like every war since way back when Ooglag hit Moogog over the head with a dinosaur bone out in front of the cave, it was about money.
Yep. And
when the southern states left, they took the income away from the United States government because we didn't have income tax back then. And the U.S. government was run on tariffs, and we've heard that term used quite a bit.
Yep.
And that was what was propping up the federal government. And when the southern states left, Lincoln said, "What will happen to my tariffs?" And he said the southern states could leave, they could keep their slaves, as long as they paid their tariffs to the United States government. And we go, I don't think we're going to pay it to a foreign country.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always follow the money, And I remember
yes,
I've been reading about this more. A lot of the states in the North were like, well, hey, let them go. We're good with
exactly.
that. Until they started seeing the financial impact, and then they started changing their tune. Because people have to remember the election, December of 1860 was the election, and South Carolina seceded soon, and several other states after that. But it was, that's December. Lincoln's inaugurated in March, and of course the Sumter's not till April, but between December and March, they had enough time to see the economic impact.
Oh yes, there was a financial disaster on Wall Street, and what people don't understand is how much the South propped up the United States government. The federal government in 1860, and I've read several accounts, but anywhere from $102 to $104 million. And we laugh at that today. They blow that off in lunchtime in Washington on cold beer and hookers or something. Anyway, but the South was paying $82 million out of that $102 million on tariffs on imported goods because we were an agricultural country and we sold cotton mainly, tobacco, sugarcane, and then we imported the manufactured items we needed from England, France, and the European countries. And so they wanted to jack the tariffs up to cut off this foreign trade coming in. And then they passed that Morrell tariff that went from about 10% tariff to 40% tariff, which would really hurt the South.
Right.
So
now
once again, money raised its ugly head.
Absolutely. Now, if I remember correctly, the Morrell tariff passed in the House before the election. It was not actually put into effect until, I guess, after secession in the Senate.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
That's correct.
All right. So when you taught high school, and this was early 70s, mid 70s, somewhere in that time frame?
Yes, we did have electricity and lights. It wasn't candlelight.
Well, my question is, was Forrest seen then as a controversial figure? Is that a more recent phenomenon?
In my class he was a hero, but no, seriously though, he was a Tennessean, and we were teaching Tennessee history and U.S. history, so he was a hero. And looking at the facts of his military career and how he raised himself from abject poverty on the frontier to being a very successful businessman, that was a really inspiring story. And so, as you said, it's been in recent years that the attack has gone against, not just against Forrest, but they tore down all the monuments on Monument Avenue in Richmond, and Lee, and Jeb Stuart, and Jefferson Davis, and all of them, and Matthew Murray, Fontaine Murray. So it wasn't just Forrest that they've gone after. They've tried to destroy all our history, and even in the northern states, they've torn down statues of Washington, Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt. So but then you have to understand that's what the communists do.
Oh yeah,
they destroy a country from the inside. Fifth columnist, and they tear down the history and say all of your history is bad, but communism is great. So you listen to what we're telling you, and we're going to be in a good shape then. So
yeah.
A lot of people buy it, though.
Oh, unfortunately, they do. And, like you said, that some of the statues in the north of Washington and others, I think they even tore down a statue of Lincoln somewhere.
Yes.
And they tear down, obviously, anybody who was a slaveholder, some who were not, but they're really just against America. They're against our whole history. And
Yes,
slavery is just something that they use as, in their mind, an excuse or justification. And I think it's, they act as if because we in our past had slavery that none of our ancestors are worth honoring or could have done anything good. And what really gets me is this comes from, number one, a bunch of communists, okay, bunch of godless communists. But in a day and age, in a generation that doesn't know what a woman is, okay,
yes.
and they're just totally immoral. I mean, they think abortion on demand is fine. They think that's a right. I mean, to me, abortion is a much more egregious crime than slavery ever was.
Yes, sir.
And I'm certainly not advocating for slavery either. But
a British historian that came up with a great point one time. He said, "You cannot condemn a household in the 17th century because it didn't have electricity, running water, and indoor plumbing." And he said, neither can you condemn the owners of that house because they didn't have modern ideas in the 1700s about slavery or individual rights or women's rights or things like that. They lived in the 1700s, and that's what they believed back then. They couldn't see 2 centuries down the road and see how things are going now or what our expectations are today. Right. Just like, what are people 100 years from now going to say about our country and how it destroyed itself?
Yeah, well, we're on that road. We're definitely on that road. So how did you become the caretaker at the boyhood home there in Chapel Hill?
I raised my hand to scratch something, and they said, "Okay, you're it." No. Commander of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, Ed Deason, asked me if I would take over the restoration work and just kind of supervising what they were doing out there. And supervising turned more into working than anything else. So I started out there in the early 1990s.
Oh, wow.
Early 2000s. And I'd been going down there when the state owned the property and wasn't doing anything with it, just weed eating and trying to repair a little bit of the house as I could. And then the Sons of Confederate Veterans acquired the property and out there, the Forrest Boyhood home right there in 1997. And so we've been working on restoring the house and taking care of it ever since. And restoring the inside of the house, trying to get some period furniture in there. We do not have any furnishings from the Forrest family. When they left and went to Mississippi, they took everything with them. But we have a young lady, Cheryl McLean in Brentwood, that's gotten us a lot of these old pewter plates, frying pans, skillets, and pots and pans for the fireplace, and a lot of the 1800s furniture. And she's done a really tremendous job on furnishing the house.
Looks like it. Wow. Now, how much of that house was still intact when you started the refurbishing?
Well, the main part of the house, the logs that we see there were there. There was no front porch. There were no windows. They'd all been shot out or broken out. It had a tin roof instead of the cedar shakes like we replaced it with. The tin had blown back and water was pouring in. And a shot like this, you could barely see the bottom of the house because of all the weeds and saplings that had grown up. So it was in really rough shape. And two of our state representatives, May Beavers, this used to be her House district, and Steve McDaniel over in West Tennessee went to the Parks Department and said, well, look, if you're just going to let it fall down, why don't you give it to a nonprofit group? We get it off the books, and we don't have the responsibility and liability in case somebody gets hurt out there.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So we do know what the house looked like in 1955. This was a painting that was done by just Mr. Jack Knox, who was the editorial cartoonist on the Nashville Banner way back when we had a conservative paper in Nashville. And he did a whole series of paintings of historic sites in Middle Tennessee and did one of the Forrest home. And the quote that we have on the front gate, carved into stone at the front gate, is that quote from Mr. Knox's painting. He rode from here into the legend of the land. So we're very appreciative of the Knox family allowing us to use that.
Now, so he was there till he was about 16, and then they moved to Mississippi, right?
Yes, sir. They were there. He was born over in Chapel Hill, and at that time that was part of Bedford County, and that's where he got the middle name.
Oh, okay.
And people often ask us, well, was Bedford County named after Bedford Forrest? I said, no, it's the other way around.
Ah.
That was Bedford County, and then they took part of Bedford County, part of Murray County, and made Marshall County, and it's Marshall County today. But he was born over in Chapel Hill, a little frontier village. And when he was 9, they bought this home that we've been showing the pictures of from the Mayfields that actually built this house in 1825. And then William Forrest bought it from them in 1830, and they moved out there. Only lived there for 3 years, 1830 to 1833. And then, as you mentioned, they moved down to northern Mississippi in 1833. And when he was 12, when Bedford was 12, but when he was 16, his father died. And all we know is he died of a fever. It could have been malaria, yellow fever, whatever. So at 16, he was the head of a household of a widowed mother and 4 other children. And he had to provide the food and make moccasins for the children and clothing from deer skins and whatever they could get. So quite a bit of responsibility was thrown on his shoulders at an early age.
Okay. What else can you tell us about his life before the war?
Well, he worked hard, went into business with his uncle in Hernando, Mississippi, bought land, bought livestock, got into cotton farming, which was the big money maker in the South End. That was the cash crop. And by the time the war came along, he was worth over $1.5 million, which by today would be about 40 to 50 million.
Wow.
So he was a very successful businessman, owns 2 or 3 farms in Mississippi, had a home in Memphis, and they always throw this at him. He was a slave dealer. Well, okay, slavery was legal back then.
Right.
And you could have been in a worse shape than been one of Mr. Forrest's slaves because, number one, he would never break up a family. He thought it was bad business. And he would try to buy back family members that had been separated. And he would not sell to certain people in the tri-state area of Tennessee, Mississippi, or Arkansas because he knew that they would mistreat the slaves. But he eventually got out of the business because there was that certain stigma about being a slave dealer. Now, it was okay to own slaves, and everybody had to that had big farming operations because the John Deere tractor hadn't been invented yet. And so, but it was that stigma about being a slave dealer, and he didn't want that to be hung over his children's head. It's kind of like today. People want to drive a Ferrari or a Lamborghini or a Mercedes, but they really don't want to hang out with people that work on them and have grease under their fingernails. And, you know, they're not a member of the club. So we don't want to hang out with those people.
Right.
So that was the double standard about being a slave dealer. But at the start of the war, he asked his slaves to serve with him during the war, to be teamsters, drive the wagons that they needed. And he promised them their freedom, that if they served through the war, regardless of the outcome of the war, he was going to give them their freedom. And about the 3rd time he was shot, he called them all together and said, boys, I don't think I'm going to make it to the end of the war, but I promise Mrs. Forrest you'd have your freedom. You're free to go now. But we would really appreciate it if you'd stick it out with us. And 44 out of the 45 stayed with him.
Wow.
And that was a better or a lower desertion rate than the U.S. Army or the Confederate Army.
Now, you said Teamsters, but they weren't just Teamsters. I mean, he had
Well, they
actually
were
part of
harness,
his guard, right?
they did what they did on the plantation. They were harness makers, they were blacksmiths, they were carpenters, drove the wagons, did all the things like that they had done prior to the war. And he had blacks in his escort company.
Okay, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, the escort company.
Yeah, and served with him in combat positions or combat billets. And back then, a general was allowed to have an escort company. And these are people that dressed up in fancy uniforms and rode around with the general and mainly stayed in the rear with the gear. You know, it was nephew and brother-in-law and all that kind of thing. Not with Forrest. The escort company was like Marine Recon or Special Forces or Navy SEALs. When the outcome of the battle was in the balance, he would throw his escort company right smack into the middle of it.
And he'd be right with them.
And oh yes, he led from the front. And the escort company would be about 100 men, but they went through over 263 during the course of the war because so many of them had been killed.
Oh wow!
And that would be a good picture of them right there. What they would probably look like.
Wow. Now I had heard that he was illiterate. Is that accurate?
Well, no, he was not illiterate, and he used a lot of colloquial expressions of the day. And he spelled by ear instead of spelling by what the spelling book said.
Well, a lot of them did that. He
was very well intelligent in business actions. I mean, you don't make $1.5 million by being ignorant. And he only went though to 6 months of formal schooling when he was a boy. But he was very intelligent, a brilliant strategist on the battlefield. And came up with some great quotes and great sayings. And no, he was not a professor of English at Oxford. I will give you that right there. But he could express himself very well, and he got his point across to the men he served with and the generals he served under.
Right. And he actually joined initially as a private, a 40-year-old private.
Here was a man that was a multi-millionaire, and anybody with that kind of money wanted to be get a high rank in the army or important political position. He walked into the recruiting office in Memphis and enlisted as a 40-year-old private. And I'm sure those teenage boys in that cavalry company probably called him Pops or Grandpa or something like that. They didn't do it very long, though.
Right.
Because he also knew Governor Isom G. Harris, the governor of Tennessee. And Governor Harris knew Forrest, and he asked him to raise a mounted battalion of cavalry and gave him a commission as a lieutenant colonel. And the rest, as they say, was history. Went from there. One of the only two people in American military history that went from the rank of private all the way up to lieutenant general.
Who was the other?
And that's Governor Harris right there that gave him his first officer's commission.
Who was the other that went from private to general?
Lieutenant General, well, now my mind went blank. Sorry. I had a Biden moment there for a minute. General Puller, Lewis B. Puller.
Chesty Puller.
Chesty
Puller.
Puller.
That's
yes, sir.
Right. That's right.
Sorry, I had a Biden moment. That just went blank.
And actually, I have this book here. I've read it. This is written by Jack Hurst. It's a biography, and I have read it. It's been a while, so I've forgotten a few things. But I thought it was a pretty good book. I thought it tried to get at the truth instead of just slandering a man on anything and everything. This other book we'll talk about a little bit later. It's reference to the Klan, but this is a good book. I recommend it if anybody out there that hasn't read about him. And there's some other good ones. You have any other recommendations on books?
Yes, sir. Well, there's several. The only one that was written during his lifetime and he proofread were the Military Campaigns of Nathan Bedford Forrest by Jordan and Pryor. And so that was written while he was still alive, and he proofread that. There's another one that's been a classic for any number of years. It's called That Devil Forrest, which takes Sherman's book by Dr. Wythe. And then one that's come out recently that's really interesting to read was by Dr. Samuel Mitchum. It's called Bust Hell Wide Open. And that was Forrest's quote at Fort Donelson when they said they were going to surrender. He said, "I didn't bring my men here to surrender. We're going out of here tonight, even if we have to bust hell wide open." And it's not anything really different on the military, the battles or things like that. But it's really a good book on Forrest's character and what type of person he was. And Dr. Mitchum made a really good point in the introduction to that book. He said, in the Western theater of the war, the professionally trained West Point generals hardly ever won, while Forrest, the untrained amateur, hardly ever lost.
And his tactics, they've been studied by our military and other militaries
Yes, sir.
For decades.
Yes, sir.
I remember my dad talking about him.
It came from Forrest, but they do study him.
Right, yeah. Well, I'm sure now they don't want to give him credit, but yeah.
No.
Yeah. Well, the Germans even did that. Rommel.
Now here's Erwin Rommel that used Forrest tactics with tanks rather than horses. And there is a story that in the 1930s, Rommel and Hans Guderian, who was the German officer that was really the father of the modern Blitzkrieg, came to Mississippi and went to some of the battlefields there, especially Bryce's Crossroads, to understand how an army of 3,000 could not only defeat, but rout an army of 8,000 off the field. Wow. And so, the modern historians say, oh, no, that never happened. But they have people in Mississippi, elderly people in the 50s, 1950s and 60s, that said, oh, yes, there were 2 German officers that were here. And they were asking about Forrest.
Wow.
So, anyway.
Well, let's talk about some of his exploits and different battles he was involved in. And we'll set aside Fort Pillow for last. But
okay.
Let's get into. I know we got some stuff on some slides here, and we can talk.
Well, he started out of course, with the Army of Tennessee, and actually fought his first battle up at Sacramento, Kentucky, in December of 1861, and then was assigned to the defense of Fort Donelson at Dover, Tennessee, on the Cumberland River. Yep. And that's where the Confederate Grant moved in on them after the fall of Fort Henry over on the Tennessee River, and then land between the rivers came over. And so they came over there, and the Confederate Army there at Fort Donelson decided they weren't going to get trapped in the fort. And so the generals decided for a breakout on the morning of February 14th. And they gave Grant a rather unusual Valentine gift, was a surprise attack, which actually opened the road to Clarksville. They could escape, or they could throw everybody into the attack and push Grant's lines back over the bluff and into the Cumberland River. Unfortunately, the West Point trained generals and the political generals came up with a third option. They turned around and marched back into the fort and then decided to surrender it. And then that's the night that they called Forrest in and told him they were going to surrender. And he said, I didn't bring my men here to surrender. We're going out of here. And he did, took out his battalion of cavalry, about 600 men, and they took out about 300 infantry. They climbed up on behind them and rode out with them. And the slide here is carrying off the dead and wounded at Franklin. Had they listened to Forrest during the war, a lot of these bloodbaths that were fought in Tennessee, like Chickamauga and like Franklin, and some of the other battles, would have probably been fought differently. And Fort Donelson is the place where he escaped. And you can go there today and see the route that he took out of there. Here's another important point about that. They got out of the fort. They got past Dover, and they came up on Lick Creek, which was frozen, and the column stopped. And Forrest asked them, said, why did you stop? And they said, well, it looks like it's frozen. He put the spurs to his horse and jumped the bank and went in, as you can see in this, and broke the ice, and there's water up to the saddle skirts there, but he got all of his men out. Yeah. And so they made their escape.
Yeah, Fort Donelson, that's a much more important battle than a lot of people realize. I live in Stewart County, and I go to Fort Donelson pretty regular. And
yes, sir.
I'm sure the park rangers up there now know the history real well, but there used to be a local guy up there that, he could just really, really get in depth on
yes,
everything about Donelson.
Well, here's an interesting point that a historian made one time. They said every battle that the Confederate Army fought in the Western Theater, whatever it was, and Hood's last desperate attempt to coming back into Tennessee in 64, every battle they fought was an attempt to regain the land and the city of Nashville that was lost after the surrender at Fort Donelson. So if you look at it, all the Confederate offensives under Bragg or under Hood or whoever, they were trying to retake the land they lost at Fort Donelson and get that back.
That was a huge loss, and it was early on.
Yes, sir.
I think we got some more slides here of the in West Tennessee.
Well,
if we can pop them up there a little bit. Okay.
Okay, now this was at Fort Pillow, and that was a Confederate attack. If you would look to the left there was an earthen wall. It wasn't a fort like Fort Apache or any of the forts on the western frontier, the logs sticking up out of the ground. Most of the forts during the War for Southern Independence were earthen forts. And so the Confederates had come down from the right there on the slide and jumped into that moat. And the Federals were just on the other side of that earthen wall to the left. So the Federals and the Confederates are only about 8 feet apart. And then on the second bugle blast, they went up over the wall and right into the fort to drive the Federals out of Fort Pillow. So it was, well, that was what happened when the Confederates came over the wall. They didn't jump up on the earthen wall and start shooting. They just laid down on top of the wall, and the first thing the Federal soldiers saw was a double-barrel shotgun or a rifle right in their face, and got a blast of that, the original shock and awe. And then the Confederates dropped their rifles and pulled out revolvers and started blasting away with those. And Forrest's men carried at least 4 revolvers, 2 on pistol belt, and then 2 across the pommel of the saddle, and then a lot of them would have another pistol or 2 stuck into their jacket or into their pistol belt. So when they moved forward, it was just like a tank coming at you. Now, Lincoln and Halleck and Grant knew what Forrest could do if he got loose in Tennessee. But Sherman was moving out of Chattanooga after the fall of Chattanooga and recaptured by the Federals. And of course, his next objective was Atlanta. And he only had single track railroads to supply an army of over 100,000 and probably 40 or 50,000 mules, horses, and everything. So Sherman knew what would happen if Forrest got loose in Tennessee and cut these railroads behind him. So Forrest could command any type of combat arms, artillery, infantry, or cavalry. Now, this is the railroad situation. You had the railroads coming out of Nashville there in the center of our slide, Nashville and Decatur, running down to Decatur, Alabama, and then across and over to Chattanooga, and then Nashville down to Chattanooga, and then Sherman would be down there in North Georgia, moving toward Atlanta. Now, they had to use the railroads in the summertime because of Muscle Shoals, Alabama. And you could not get these great big steamboats and barges up over the shoals like these steamboats down there at the wharf at Lower Broad in Nashville. You could not get them up over the shoals, so they depended on the railroad, and mainly the Nashville and Decatur, because Sherman had to use the Nashville and Chattanooga to send empty boxcars back to Nashville because of Mont Eagle Mountain. And they didn't have these great big diesel engines then that could pull up over the mountain. So the full boxcars came down that straight north-south route from Nashville down to Decatur and then over to Chattanooga. They'd send the empties and the wounded back from Chattanooga to Nashville over Mont Eagle Mountain. So if Forrest got in there and destroyed either one or both of those railroads, then it was going to be all over. Now, a lot of the fighting his men did was on foot. Forrest was not a typical cavalry commander. He used the horse to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible. Then he would dismount his men and they would fight on foot. And a lot of times it was in close quarters, like at Shiloh or like at Bryce's Crossroads or Fort Pillow. And it was hand-to-hand fighting. And once the rifles were fired, they didn't have time to reload. They just used them as clubs to slug it out with the Federal soldiers. So Forrest could adapt to pretty much whatever the situation dictated. And I think that was one of the real geniuses of Bedford Forrest. Bragg could organize an army. He could train an army. He had a great battle plan. But then once the first shot was fired, his battle plans just flew off away. And there's Braxton Bragg. His battle plans took off like a covey of quail. And he could not adjust on the battlefield.
You know, and I know you were in Vietnam, and so
Yes,
you were a lieutenant, and I mean, I know, having been in the military, that you know your plan never survives the first contact.
No.
I mean, it's out the window. You have all of these great elaborate plans, and the first contact, it's all out the window.
That's it. A military historian said, your battle plans are over as soon as the first shot's fired. So I think that's why Forrest was so great. He could adjust on the battlefield. And he wasn't sitting back in a headquarters somewhere 10 miles behind the front line and sending out orders here, there, and everywhere. He was up there with his men. It's like a head football coach being down on the sideline. You can sit up in the press box, that's fine, but you need to be on the sideline and see what the will and the esprit de corps and the feeling of your players are out on the field, instead of just sitting way away. And that's what he did. He could be there and he could see where there was a weak point in the line, or where you needed to praise these men, or where you need to go over there and cuss this bunch out that weren't doing what they were supposed to do. And I think that's what made him a great commander out in the field. He was in tune with what was going on the front lines, and not just sitting, as they say, back in the rear with the gear. So Forrest was a great hero. And of course, this is the statue that was over his grave at Forest Park in Memphis. That has been deemed one of the greatest equestrian statues anywhere in the world, North America or in Europe. And then, of course, in 2017, the city of Memphis decided they wanted to tear that down and get it out of there and appease the communist criminals.
It's disgraceful that our state allowed that. I mean, it's just flat out. It's a disgrace. Our legislature and our governor disgraced our state by allowing that to happen. Bottom line.
Well, the highway patrol was coming down from Jackson to stop it, and they were called off by our attorney general and our governor at that time.
Yeah, Haslam and Slattery, right?
Yep, Haslam.
Yeah.
But here's the point. God works in mysterious ways. After they took that statue down in 2017, I said, I will never spend a dime in Memphis, and I don't. If I'm going west to see my brother out in Texas, I get gas in Jackson and then cross the river and get gas again in Arkansas. I don't have anything to do with Memphis. But that saved that statue, having it taken down and put in a warehouse, because when the whole country erupted with all the riots and everything in 2020, if it had been standing, they would have torn it to pieces.
Oh, yeah.
So by having it in a warehouse, out of sight and out of the way, they actually saved that. And then the attorneys for the Forrest family and the attorneys for the Sons of Confederate Veterans sued the mayor and the city council in Memphis. They broke 5 felony laws when they took that statue down. They cooked up a crooked deal with a fake nonprofit group and sold Forest Park for $1,000, which was valued at a little over $7 million for that property in downtown Memphis. And there were no open bids or anything on that. So they were looking at that. And so they said, all right, you give us a statue and you help us reinter the body of General Forrest and his wife that were buried right underneath that statue there. You help us reinter the bodies and get them out of there, and we'll drop the charges. So they did. So now General and Mary Ann Montgomery Forrest have been reburied at the Sons of Confederate Veterans headquarters in Columbia, Tennessee. The statue is there, and the SCV is raising money, and there's Mary Ann right there, raising money to put the pedestal back and put the equestrian statue back up on top of their graves, just like they were at Forest Park in Memphis. So it's funny how things work out sometimes.
Yeah, you're right. If it was up in 2020, it would have definitely been destroyed.
Yes, sir.
We're going to talk a little bit about Fort Pillow.
Okay.
Now, we always hear it called the Fort Pillow Massacre.
Yes.
But does it even
propaganda?
Absolutely. Does it even meet the definition of a massacre?
Well, the definition of a massacre is a total annihilation. And that did not happen at Fort Pillow. It was a one-sided victory, that's true, but it wasn't a massacre. And the people that, all of these critics and the historians on The View and CNN and all of these great historians that they drag out on TV, they know nothing about Forrest. If he'd ordered a massacre, they wouldn't have taken one single person out of there alive. And the casualty count, and this was from a Confederate naval officer, there were 201 prisoners that were taken out alive.
Right.
Another 130 were too seriously wounded to be moved, and Forrest and his men left them there that night with the federal medical staff. So as far as the definition of a massacre goes, that was a total lie. It was war propaganda, and the Yankee government needed something to fire up the citizens in the North. Recruiting was really going downhill in the North. It looked like the war was never going to be over. They were having to bring in boatloads of mercenaries from Ireland and Germany to fill up the ranks in the Federal Army. And so they needed something to whip up this hatred and animosity for the South. And it's just like, well, World War I, they had this story about the Germans bayoneting Belgian babies and holding them up on their rifle on the bayonet. Well, it's all lies, but that's what war is. Winston Churchill said the first casualty in war is the truth,
Yeah.
and that is true.
Absolutely. Now, the at Fort Pillow, I mean, that's because there were some black soldiers there,
Yes.
and there were white. Most of the whites, I'm assuming, were local Unionists.
Yes, sir. And deserters from the Confederate Army.
And deserters. Now,
the Yankees were paying better.
yeah. Now, well, let me back up here a couple things. I want to hit this before I get to that. You mentioned a minute ago mercenaries. Now, a lot of these people that came from Europe, you had a lot of the former participants in the Revolution of 48 from Europe.
The 48ers.
48ers. And the 48ers are what?
Marxist.
Absolutely.
Bolsheviks, communists.
Yeah. In the Union Army. Not the
Union,
Confederate
well,
Army,
not
in the
just
Union
in the Army, but in Lincoln's government.
Yeah.
And, Karl Marx wrote glowing editorials about Abraham Lincoln and had it published in Horace Greeley's, I think it was the New York World, was his newspaper in New York. Anyway, in Horace Greeley's newspaper. And Karl Marx told that in order for Marxism or the Bolshevik Revolution, or they didn't call it communism back then, but socialism, to be successful, you needed a strong dictator as president. And they saw Lincoln as a dictator. And they saw Lincoln as the person that could start communism in this country. And not only did he get glowing reports from Karl Marx, Hitler wrote a lot about him and how he thought Lincoln did was a great leader, because he said National Socialism would need a strong dictator to take over the country.
Strong dictator, strong central government.
A strong central government. You're exactly right. But that's in Mein Kampf in the German version. They've cleaned that up on the English version of Hitler's Mein Kampf. You don't get that in there. But if you get a German copy of it, then that's what Hitler said about Lincoln. So Lincoln has some great admirers in Karl Marx and Adolf Hitler.
Two of the worst of the worst. Wow. Okay, so now Fort Pillow, and I want to talk about this a little bit about this. Before the battle in that area, let's talk some about what had been happening. I think before Forrest came back, there really weren't a lot of Confederate troops in that area, correct?
No, sir. Tennessee had fallen to the Federal Army. West Tennessee was occupied. They had Memphis. They had Jackson, Paducah, Kentucky. And Forrest that winter was in Columbus, Mississippi, in northern Mississippi. He had been assigned 2 cavalry divisions, one under James Chalmers and one under Abraham Buford. And Buford's cavalry division was dismounted, which is just saying pretty much they were infantry. They were foot sloggers.
Right.
So Forrest and his men were going on a raid into West Tennessee and Western Kentucky for horses. And when they left Columbus, Mississippi, Fort Pillow was not mentioned. That was not in their operational orders. And they left on March the 1st, headed into West Tennessee and all the way up to Paducah, Kentucky, and then back to Mayfield and coming back down. That was Forrest's second raid into West Tennessee. And once again, none of that time, that 5 weeks they were on that raid, was Fort Pillow ever mentioned. And why would they even go there in the first place? Everybody knows cavalry can't attack a fort. You have to lay siege to it. And even if they could capture it, Fort Pillow was right on the Mississippi River, and the Federal Navy could come along and just blast them out of there anytime they wanted to. So why go 60 miles out of your way to take a fort that you're not going to keep, and you run the risk of losing a lot of your men for nothing? Well, they left on the 1st of March. By April the 4th, they were coming out of Tennessee, and then he sent a supplementary order or report to his commanding officer down in Mississippi, Stephen D. Lee. He said, "We will attend to Fort Pillow." So what happened after 5 weeks that changed all the plans? The civilians in West Tennessee came to Forrest and asked him to do something about the federal troops in Fort Pillow that were coming out of Fort Pillow and robbing the civilians in West Tennessee, burning their homes. William Brownlow was one of the officers there, son of Parson Brownlow, or as James Brownlow was the son of William Brownlow. Parson Brownlow, that was one of the Reconstruction governors in Tennessee after the war. He said that any Confederate soldier in West Tennessee would be shot on sight. And Fielding Hurst was the one that they really wanted to go after, a kin of ancestor of Jack Hurst. And that was the one they wanted. He was the worst. Just to give you one example, he captured 7 Confederate soldiers, had 6 of them shot. They were not treated as prisoners of war. But they were the lucky ones. The 7th one, a Lieutenant Dobbs, was an officer. They smashed his face in. They cut off several parts of his body, slit his throat from ear to ear, and left him out in the field to bleed out. So this was the example of the type of people that were at Fort Pillow. And this is what they were doing not only to Confederate soldiers that had come there to get back to their ancestors in West Tennessee to get food and horses or whatever, but that's what they were doing to the civilians. And that's why Forrest went to Fort Pillow, to take these war criminals out of there. And you see on our map, Fort Pillow's over there on the Mississippi River, and Forrest had gone up through Jackson, Mayfield, Union City, all the way up to Paducah, and was coming back out of West Tennessee. They didn't need to stay there, but they did it for the civilians, and they were attacking the women. And that was one thing you didn't do when Forrest was in the territory. It's one thing to make war against men, but you don't make war against women. That is something that just is not going to happen, and he's not going to allow it to happen. But with all those blue dots and things there, that's what they had to fight against. Now, this was dawn on April the 12th, 1864. Bob McCullough's cavalry overran the pickets and took the high ground around Fort Pillow. And the Federal soldiers had no idea that Confederates were anywhere close to them. And all of a sudden, these horsemen came roaring out of the woods and overran the picket line. And once the Confederates had taken this ridge around Fort Pillow, and there's our map. Fort Pillow's on the left. It was built on a bluff over the Tennessee River. And the ridge to the right is actually higher than the fort. So once the Confederates had that ridge, for all intents and purposes, the battle was over. Because now they're firing down into the fort, and the Federal soldiers are running from the cabins down there to the south of the fort and out of the tents that were on the fort. Oh, and by the way, the blacks had the tents inside the fort, and the white Union soldiers had the cabins down there. They didn't believe in integration back then. And so once all that shooting took place up on that ridge, they're running to the earthworks to try to man the earthworks. Now, the Mississippi River was right at the base of that bluff there. And today, Fort Pillow State Park, the Mississippi has moved west. The channel has moved west off of our slide there. So it's all just woods and swamps down there now. But back then, the Mississippi River was right up against the Tennessee side of the shore. But once the Confederates got that high ground, they had snipers that were picking off anybody that stuck their head up over the wall of the fort. And 3 times, Forrest sent in a white flag and offered a chance for the fort to surrender. And nobody would have been killed. Well, there would have been a few that were picked off by the snipers. So once again, they're out there with a white flag offering terms of surrender to the fort. And each time the commanding officer of the fort turned it down. Their only officer that had any combat experience at all, Major Booth, he was picked off by one of those snipers, one of the first shots that was fired. The command then fell to a Major Bradford, who even the Federal officers said was worthless. He had ducked out of some financial shenanigans in Iowa and was hiding out in the Army as an officer way down here in Tennessee. So he wasn't much for a commanding officer. They didn't know the situation they were in. They were in an untenable position, and they refused to surrender. And as we had on our earlier slide there, the Confederates, when they refused the surrender, they rushed down off of that ridge, jumped into that moat around the fort. About half of them got up on that little ledge right outside that earthen wall, and then they reached down and pulled the rest of them up and got them up on the wall of the fort. And then on the second bugle blast, they went over the wall and into the fort. Now, most of the casualties from Fort Pillow on the Federal side were in those rows of tents when they broke and ran. And here's our statistics disproving that claim that it was a massacre. And these numbers came from Captain Ferguson, the U.S. Navy, who was there right after the battle. They had 200. The U.S. soldiers had 221 killed, but Forrest took out 206 prisoners, and they left behind 130 wounded that were too seriously wounded to be moved, and left them with the federal medical staff that night. The Confederates only had 14 killed and 86 wounded, and they said, well, that's why it was a massacre. The casualties were so different from one side to the other. But the thing was, you had a fort full of inexperienced soldiers and inexperienced officers that did not know the situation they were in.
Oh, and they were drunk.
And that's right. After the Confederates got over the wall, they found barrels of whiskey all along these earthen walls of the fort that the white U.S. officers had given to the blacks because they didn't think the blacks were going to fight without being juiced up on whiskey. And even during these truces for discussion, the chance to surrender, the blacks were up on the wall of the fort shouting all kinds of insults and obscene gestures at the Confederates. And this was the days before the NFL and the NBA and trash talk did not go over very well. So they made a bad situation worse. And there was already bad feelings between the Confederates and the Federals because what they had done to a lot of their relatives in West Tennessee. And the soldiers in Fort Pillow just made it worse. Now, I'm not going to say that not a single Federal soldier was shot after they were surrendered. That that probably did happen for revenge. But once again, if Forrest had ordered a massacre, they wouldn't have taken out a single blue soldier.
Right. And a lot of from what I remember reading, Forrest was, of course he led from the front, but by the time he got there to the fort, a lot of those people would have already been killed from the earlier attack.
The most casualties that were taken were in that initial assault. When those Confederates came over the wall, first thing the Federals saw, as we were mentioning earlier, were double-barrel shotguns and rifles right in their face with a huge blast of that. Confederates dropped their rifles, pulled out the revolvers, and started firing away. And when they made that break to get to the bluff and get down below the bluff, they were only about 30 yards away from where the Confederates were. So even a bad shot could hit something. And when they ran through those rows of tents, which compacted them into very tight rows. So all the Confederates had to do was just shoot at the mass of soldiers right out in front of them. They were going to hit somebody.
Yeah.
So that was it. It was over. Now, Forrest got in there about 20 minutes after the initial attack went over the wall. He ordered the flag to be cut down because as long as the flag was flying, that meant the fort hadn't surrendered. So once they cut that flag down and the Federal soldiers were off that bluff and down on that river road, then that's where a lot of the accusations of people being shot after they were surrendered was going on. But it was a total chaos down there. Confederates were coming down from the north to the south down the river road, coming up from the south to the north on the river road. And then the ones that had come over the wall were up on the bluff, and they were firing right down on top of them. So the Federal soldiers were caught not only in a crossfire, but really in a triple fire. So that's where a lot of the casualties were piled up down there as well.
Yeah. So they still stick to that. They still cling to that Fort Pillow Massacre, and they would probably have you. I think they want you to believe that most of the garrison was black, and that's why it happened, which is obviously not true. But the other thing too, Congress had hearings on this, yes, and they brought Forrest in to testify
after the war.
The war. So does anybody believe that if they had anything on him, that they wouldn't have strung him up?
No, and but you have to go back to war propaganda, and that's what they used. They had an investigation right after Fort Pillow while the war was still going on, and there were about 40,000 copies of that congressional investigation were printed. At that time, that was the largest printing of any congressional investigation that had come along. And so they printed 40,000 copies, and they gave them out to newspapers all over the North to whip up this anti-South feeling. And like I said, the so-called eyewitnesses at the Fort Pillow Massacre were just basically lies. The eyewitness report that was written for the newspaper was written by a newspaper reporter in Knoxville. which is 395 miles away from Fort Pillow. And if he were an eyewitness, that guy had one heck of a pair of eyes to see over the Cumberland Plateau and the Middle Tennessee Basin all the way to Mississippi River. So it was war propaganda. And because blacks were involved, then Forrest was our first victim of a racial hoax. Yep. And they were using the blacks to whip up this sentiment and saying that they massacred all these poor black troops because they didn't want blacks fighting in the U.S. Army, and they were going to kill all the black troops that were in the U.S. Army and so forth and so on. But it was war propaganda. And the newspapers went with it, so fake news is not a recent phenomenon.
Yeah, no, by any means.
That's
by
gone
any
on
means.
for a long time.
Yeah. Fake news is not new, that's for sure.
No, sir.
So, got a few other.
Well, one other thing about that, they were asking General Sherman, who was certainly no friend of Forrest, and he did his own investigation, and he said no, it was just a one-sided battle. And he said pretty much the same thing. He had fought against Forrest enough times to know what type of person he was, and what a headache he was. And of course, and we mentioned Sherman's quote: "If he cost 10,000 lives and bankrupts to the Treasury, Forrest must be hunted down and killed or captured before there's any peace in Tennessee." Yeah. And so he was not a friend of Forrest, but he said there was nothing at Fort Pillow that would warrant any kind of retaliatory action against Forrest.
Right. And Sherman is somebody who would know what a war crime is because he did a lot of that. He did a lot of war crimes.
And he wrote the book on it.
Absolutely. Him and Sheridan and Grant, yes. And Lincoln knew all about it. People need to read more about what happened in the war. What happened in the Shenandoah Valley? What happened in Georgia? What happened in South Carolina and in Tennessee and pretty much throughout the South? I mean, you talk about making war on civilians, women and children. It's like, okay, let's go in here. There's no soldiers. We're just going to burn down every house. After we steal whatever we want, we're going to kill whatever we can't use as far as livestock goes. We're going to take personal possessions. We're going to destroy the place. Yes. And they did that repeatedly. I mean, the Union Army as a whole. And this, what I'm saying, you can read accounts of Union officers who were disgusted by it. Okay, but it was not an aberration. It happened on a regular basis. It was policy. It may not have been written policy, but it was policy. Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons that Lincoln was assassinated. John Booth felt that Lincoln was a war criminal because what he had done to Confederate prisoners of war, the Confederate prisoners that were executed and murdered. And I've always said that Lincoln was the only leader of a victorious country that was executed for war crimes after the war. And that was revenge for what he had done. And they all say, well, Booth was, crazy, and all this kind of stuff like that. But there were letters that he wrote about what Lincoln had done to have a Confederate soldier executed that was the brother of a girl he was dating. And Booth wanted revenge against Lincoln for what he had done there and having legitimate prisoners of war executed.
I'd never heard that.
So
not a surprise because they don't want to teach that in the schools. I think the biggest.
No, they won't teach you that one. No, sir.
Yeah, I think the biggest tragedy of the Lincoln assassination, and I'm not saying I agree with going up and shooting somebody in the back of the head, but I think the biggest tragedy was that it happened in April of 1865 instead of April of 64.
There you go.
I mean, because then it, of course, made, it was after the fact then, and as bad as he was, as bad as Lincoln was, I still think Reconstruction would not have been as bad under him as it was under the Radical Republicans.
Well, that is possibly true. But on the other hand, Lincoln said a lot of things that he didn't live up to. We'll have to remember Lincoln when he was a representative from Illinois in the United States Congress, and Texas came in as a state. Yep. New England threatened to secede because they're going to make they said they're going to make 2 or 3 states out of Texas. And that means there'll be 2, 4, 6, maybe even 8 Southern conservative Democrats in Congress that will tip the balance of Congress away from the Whigs. Yep. And give it to the conservative Democrats. And so New England was threatening to secede, and Lincoln was all for it. And even during the war, the Northern Democrats or Copperheads, they were against Lincoln. They weren't aiding the Confederacy. They were just against the war because it was costing too much money and costing too much in lives. But back when Texas was coming in as a state and New England was threatening to secede, Lincoln said, any people, anywhere, have the right to withdraw and form their own government at their own choosing. This is a most sacred and most inalienable right.
Yeah, you mean like
so
the way our country started out?
All for secession then. But then when he was president, he changed that when the southern states took him up on it. And I've often said that probably Lincoln was listening to the Eagles, Hotel California, that said, you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. So maybe he heard that song somewhere.
Yeah. Here's the thing too. He told a huge lie. His he went back to, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, and basically said that the states were created by the federal government, which is historically inaccurate. The states
it's backwards.
Yeah, the
states were here first, and then the Constitutional Convention, they created the federal government. Yeah. So he got it totally backwards.
Yeah, and for him to say perpetual union, it said perpetual union not in the Constitution, but it said it in the Articles of Confederation. But wait a minute, what did we do with those, with the perpetual union or the Articles of Confederation? Well, we ignored it, or they ignored it at the time, and instead of having to have 13 to change anything, we decided if we got 9 people to go along with this Constitutional Convention, then those 9 will form another country. Now, we ended up with all 13.
Exactly.
Eventually, we didn't get North Carolina and Rhode Island right away. They joined later. But yeah, he built on a total lie. That the idea that you could not secede. I mean, our country was founded on secession. Okay?
Exactly.
The
we
states
seceded from Great Britain.
Yeah.
And that was fine. And we all shoot off firecrackers and eat watermelon on the 4th of July and celebrate that secession.
Yeah.
But then we don't get to celebrate our secession in the South and our Independence Day.
Yep. There's a few other things I want to hit here.
Sure.
So after the war with Forrest, what was his attitude as far as, he fought hard for those 4 years.
Yes, sir.
When the war was over, what was his attitude towards the government and towards, the freed slaves, the blacks? What was his attitude towards them?
Well, the North was afraid that people like John Mosby and Joe Shelby and Forrest were going to carry on guerrilla operations. And this war may drag on for 10 or 15 years. And that's what they were afraid of, that those people, they didn't need a government to keep fighting. And if the Confederate government and the major armies like Lee's Army in Northern Virginia or Joe Johnston's Army of Tennessee surrendered, they could have cared less. They saw the government in Richmond as an impediment to actually carry on the war. And so that's what the North was afraid of, that Forrest would never surrender, or John Mosby, or some of these others. But Forrest said when the war was over, it was over. You'd done the best you could. And he advised his men in his farewell address. He said, I have never on the field of battle sent you where I was unwilling to go myself, nor would I now advise you to follow a course that I would not follow. And so he said, boys, you did the best you could, but it's over. And it's time to go home and try to rebuild your life. And that's what he did. He went back to Memphis, tried to patch up whatever he could of his farm that was left, and tried to make a living for his family and his children. And he spent a lot of it, what little money he had, but he spent a lot of it taking care of the orphans and widows of soldiers that had served under him, and taking care of his former slaves. They weren't slaves anymore, but their homes had been burned down, and their crops had been taken, and their cattle had all been run off by the Federal Army when they came through. The Federals didn't care if they stole from whites or blacks. Didn't make any difference from them. And so what are you going to do with all of these people? They have no jobs. They have no place to go. They have nothing to sustain them. And that's what Forrest was trying to do, was help not only the whites, but the blacks that were in his area, living area there. So he started, got investors. They started building the Memphis, Marion, and Selma Railroad. and he caught a lot of heat because he hired blacks. And he hired blacks and paid them the same wages he was paying whites. And at that time, that was a no-no. And so they were giving him a lot of grief, and he just shot right back at them and said, well, why shouldn't I? They're doing the same work that the whites are doing. Why can't I pay them the same amount of money? And so that was sort of his attitude.
Now, that grief was not just from other Southerners, but that was from some in the federal government, some in the Freedmen's Bureau and other organizations like that, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And they talk about what a terrible racist he was and a horrible person and all that sort of nonsense. But why would those men that were serving with him during the war, that he gave them their freedom to before the war was even over, before the 13th Amendment had even passed, why would they stick it out with him during a war and take the chance of being killed if he was such a horrible person? And of course they say, oh, Forrest started the Ku Klux Klan. No, he didn't. Obviously, people that don't know anything about history. The Klan was actually started by 6 former Confederate soldiers in December of 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee. Now, Forrest was way over in Memphis. So if he started the Klan in Pulaski, what did he use? Did he use Spotted Al Gore's internet that he claimed he invented and go from Memphis to Pulaski to start the Klan? No. And they used to have a plaque on one of the law offices in Pulaski with the 6 names of the former Confederate soldiers that started the Klan. And it didn't start as a political organization. It started like a military organization for former soldiers, like the American Legion of the VFW. Right. And they get all bent out of shape when I say that. And I say, no, you're not listening. I said the original Klan.
Yep.
And then once Reconstruction got so bad in the South and they passed the Franchise Act where Southern whites couldn't vote, only people who could vote were illiterate blacks and carpetbaggers that had come down here. So you couldn't elect a sheriff. You couldn't elect a tax assessor. You had nothing to protect you. They've had to form vigilante groups all over the South to protect themselves and especially protect the white women.
Yep.
So in in South Carolina, it was the Red Shirts. In Texas and Louisiana, it was the Knights of the White Camellia. In southern Middle Tennessee and northern Alabama, the Klan then changed from this just kind of an informal fraternity or whatever you want to call it to a political organization to try to get the Reconstruction government out of the South.
Yeah. And the Reconstruction government, we're talking basically the Republican Party at that time. And the
Yes.
radical Republicans did everything they could to sow dissent between the former Confederates and the newly freed slaves. And because they wanted
Exactly.
all those black votes, because if they didn't get all those black votes in the Republican Party, there was enough Democrats, and that was another reason why they wouldn't let the former Confederates vote. There were enough Democrats in the South and enough Democrats in the North that they could have, the people that they just defeated in battle could be elected to office, and that didn't go along with what they wanted to do. That was not their plan. They wanted to subject them. They wanted to punish them. They couldn't secede, but oh wait, now we're going to treat you like you're no longer in the Union. You have to pass this amendment. You have to do this. You have to do that if you want to be back in the Union. But wait a minute, you said we couldn't leave the Union. Now we have to do these things to get back in the Union. And oh, by the way, how can we vote on an amendment, whether you're talking about the 14th. Now, it wasn't an issue with the 13th because all of the states, all the reconstituted states, by December of 1865, had passed the 13th Amendment. That was already done. Now, granted, some of that started really before the actual end of the war, because I think there was a couple states that had already, I think maybe Louisiana and one other state maybe had already before April had already rejoined the Union, or am I mistaken on that? Anyway, early on, some of them were reconstituted, but by the December of 65, 13th Amendment had already been passed. But then when it came to the 14th Amendment, well, wait a minute, these states that just passed the 13th Amendment didn't want to pass the 14th Amendment, and neither did a lot of the northern states. So it's so bad that they needed to rely on the southern states to do it. Southern states didn't want to do it. Well, okay, you're not going to get back in the states, back into the country until you pass this amendment. How can you pass an amendment if you're not a state?
They weren't. They abolished the states after the war and had military districts to have military government running everything in the South. And like Virginia and I think North Carolina were District 1, South Carolina and Georgia District 2. And So when they needed the votes for the 14th Amendment, they go, whoops, we don't have enough states. We don't have any states in the South. We have military districts. So they had to pass, as you mentioned, all these contrived laws to get them back into the Union, to have these military districts turned back into states so they could pass the 14th Amendment. So that's how convoluted and screwed up the federal government was back then. And the radical Republicans. What we don't realize today is that the Republican Party back then was the nutcase party, like the Democrats are today.
Yep.
And they would have had AOC and Maxine Waters, and they would all have been Republicans back in the 1860s.
Yep.
So,
yep. I mean, there's people like Thaddeus Stevens and others who were just wacko crazy, and they wanted to punish the South.
Well, they wanted the leaders of the South executed, Jefferson Davis and Lee, and they wanted them all hung as traitors, treason. And the only one they really went after was Major Wirtz from down at Andersonville, and they did hang him after the war and accused him of creating the horrible situations at Andersonville. But you go back and say, okay, who was responsible for the Andersonville prison camp being overcrowded? Well, it was Abraham Lincoln. He stopped the prisoner exchange. And during the war, up until about late 1863, early 64, if you had 100 of our guys and we had 100 of your guys, we'd agree to swap them out and trade them back. So they didn't have these large prisoner of war camps. But Lincoln stopped it. He said that the federal soldiers, once they're exchanged, they won't go back in the army. But the Southerners, when they're exchanged, they go right back in the army. Now we've got to fight them again. So he stopped the prisoner exchange. So Andersonville was designed for 300, and they had over 3,000 there. And then not only that, but the Confederates said, look, we can't feed them. We can't feed our own people. You've captured Jacksonville, Florida. Why don't you send over medical supplies and food to your prisoners and send the Sanitary Commission with them, which is the forerunner of the Red Cross. Send the Sanitary Commission with them so you make sure that those food items and medical supplies go to your prisoners, and we don't take it. And Lincoln turned it down. He wouldn't do it. They said, well, whatever they're feeding them, that's less food that the Southerners have. And the guards at Andersonville were getting the same rations as the prisoners. And you've seen all these photographs of these horrible emaciated bodies that look like skeletons, and
right.
And, well, they didn't take any pictures of the guards, and they look just as bad as the prisoners.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen a picture of that. But they also don't tell you about all of the Confederate prisoners that died in northern prisons. A lot of them froze to death.
And they had the food.
Yeah.
And they had the winter clothing.
Yeah.
And how many of them froze to death at Elmira, New York, and they wouldn't give them winter clothing in the wintertime in New York because they said, well, if we did, they might look like civilians if they escaped. So we can't do that. And then Camp Douglas in Chicago, the guards used to go by and just fire their rifles right through the wooden walls of these barracks and try to hit some of the prisoners that were on the inside there. Nobody did anything about that. So they can't point their finger at Andersonville and say it was bad when they had so many bad situations in the North.
Absolutely. One other thing I want to hit about the Klan. There's a book here, and I got this at the Confederate Museum, and it's Nathan Bedford Forrest and the Ku Klux Klan. And in this book, it talks about the fact that, number one, it was a secretive organization, so there's no way to actually tie Forrest to it. He also had testimony before Congress about whatever dealings he had, but nothing can prove that he started it. He did denounce it and encourage people to abandon it around 1869, I believe, after things started getting pretty bad. But I mean, they make it sound like he was the founder of it and the Grand Wizard, and you really cannot prove that.
Here's the point: they couldn't defeat Forrest on the battlefield.
Right.
So they had to come up with lies and misinformation to drag his name through the mud.
Right.
And the so-called massacre at Fort Pillow, the Northern War propaganda for the Fort Pillow Massacre, and then Forrest as the founder and the leader of the Ku Klux Klan, another batch of lies and fake news. So that's the only way they could defeat Forrest, was to lie about him in a South that had no way to contradict that. We don't have access to the national TV. We don't have national access to all the cable networks. Right. And even supposedly the conservative cable network like Fox and so forth, they don't get it right.
No. They're all Lincolnites. I mean, they're all Lincolnites, and they believe that Lincoln was this great guy who saved the. Well, I mean, you destroyed the Constitution, so I don't know how you can destroy the Constitution and at the same time save the Union. You can do one of the two, but you can't do both. At least in that situation.
Well, that's what I always get a chuckle out of. These so-called conservatives like Bill O'Reilly and the late Rush Limbaugh and Jesse Waters and all of these, they rant and rave and now what's his name, Levin, they rant and rave about how terrible the federal government is. It's so rotten. It's this, that, and the other thing. Oh, but Lincoln was great. Lincoln was great.
Yeah. Well, he put us on this path.
Has got all his rants against the federal government, but then he's got a bust of Lincoln sitting right there over his shoulder.
That's where it started.
You know who you're talking about?
Yeah, that's where it started. That's all the Lincolnites. I mean, that's where the centralization started. That was our first dictator. I mean, much more so than Jackson, in my opinion. But that's another thing too. You never hear. Everybody's heard about the Klan, and you heard about the things the Klan has done. Number one, the Civil War Klan or the Reconstruction Klan, that ended, and later on, really in the teens and 20s, that was the bigger Klan, and that Klan was not limited to the South. That Klan was in California. That Klan was in in Indiana. It was in New York. It was all over the country. It was a very popular movement in the 1920s, North and South.
Exactly, it was. And some of the biggest Klan organizations were in the Midwest, Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio, right through there. And they say the flag, like the one we have behind us here, was the Klan flag. No, it wasn't. And I've seen that picture, and we've published it in every Confederate publication that's come out. That big Klan rally in Washington, D.C. in the 20s that you were talking about. Yeah. And they had Klan members sidewalk to sidewalk coming up Pennsylvania Avenue, and as far back as you could see, with the Capitol being a very small item in the very rear of the picture, and every single flag that was in that march was a U.S. flag. There was not one single Confederate flag in any of that big Klan rally in D.C. in the 20s. Yep. So they get their flags mixed up a lot of times. So.
Another thing you never hear about the Union Leagues. I never knew about the Union Leagues until like the last 5 years. And I know you're familiar with them. Let's tell everybody about the Union Leagues a little bit so they have some reference for how, why initially the Klan came about.
Well, what you have to understand is the South had no government of its own after the war. The federal government passed the Franchise Act, which meant that anybody that had served in the Confederate government or in the Confederate military or given aid to the Confederate military could not vote. You lost the vote. And even somebody that wasn't in the Confederate Army but supported the Confederacy. And you got a neighbor that has a grudge against you, and you say, well, I've seen old Dave where he sold a bag of corn to Forest Cavalry when they came through here. Bang, you lost your right to vote, which meant you couldn't vote for a sheriff. You couldn't vote for a tax assessor. So they could set taxes at whatever they wanted to on your property, and an astronomical figure for a little 12 by 12 cabin, you couldn't pay it, so they took it and took your land. And that's where a lot of the rich people in the North gobbled up acres and acres of property in the South, was from these tax assessors, these crooked governments in Reconstruction that flat out stole the land, like Hilton Head and a lot of the other places around here that were taken over by the northern businessmen. And then the Union Leagues were set up to protect the Reconstruction government. And a lot of that went into getting these the illiterate blacks to vote, and they would just haul them around from precinct to precinct to vote. And of course they couldn't read, so they would have somebody there from the Union League or the GAR or some of these other organizations, the Freedmen's Bureau or whatever, and they say, oh, well, you make your mark right here in this column right here. That's who you need to vote for. Yep. That's what they did.
And the Union League there were militias. There were black militias.
Yes.
And all the things that you hear about the Klan perpetrating, Those things had also been perpetrated prior to that by the Union Leagues.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
And had it not been for the Reconstruction government, the radical Reconstruction government in the South, the Klan would have been totally unnecessary, or you'd never heard anything about it, or it would have just been that kind of a joke that those boys had in Pulaski, riding around and putting on costumes and telling people they were the ghost from Shiloh or something like that. Everybody knew it was a joke. And they always made sure they rode by their girlfriend's house, and she would pretend to be scared and faint, but when she fainted, she always fell into her boyfriend's arms. And that's the way it was set up. So everybody knew it was a joke until the Reconstruction government got so bad and some of these attacks against the Southern civilians became a common occurrence. They had to protect themselves. And people say, well, they turned against the blacks. They turned against the blacks because they were collaborators with the enemy.
Right.
They sided with the enemy. And were the French really bad people because they turned against the French collaborators that sided with the Germans? When the German armies were pulling out of France and heading back into Germany after the Allies had landed at Normandy and they were coming across France, and then the German armies were pulling out of Paris and heading back to the German frontier, the French turned on these people that had been collaborators with the Germans. And we've seen those photographs of women that had their heads shaved and were beaten, and guys that were beaten up and even killed. Well, they were collaborators with the enemy. So why would the Southerners all of a sudden say, oh, well, that's okay. You can work with the enemy when they're down here, and then after it's all said and done, we're going to just welcome you back in with open arms. That goes against human nature. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite quote or story about Forrest?
Well, we're going to be on till about 1 a.m. this morning. Is that right? Well, let me give you one quote. One that he is mostly misquoted for. He never said firstest with the mostest. Now, he was not an English major, and he did not teach at Oxford University, Shakespeare, or anything like that. The quote was, and this is from 3 different people during the war, and one of those 3 was a Union officer that was captured. He said, never stand to receive the attack of the enemy. Always take the initiative and get there first with the most men. And like I said, he was not an English professor, but he never said firstest with the mostest. But Robert Self Henry wrote a book on Forrest. It's called First with the Most Forrest. And he debunked that right in the first chapter. And he said, but our South-hating and Forrest-hating enemies will never let us hear the lastest of that. So that's always going to be thrown in our face. Yeah. And another one, as we said right at the end of the war, he told his men, he said, you know, I've never on the field of battle sent you where I was unwilling to go myself, nor would I now advise you to a course which I would not follow. So and one other incident, I've had a lot of people, in fact, there's a book about it, after the war, his conversion and membership in a church, conversion to Christianity, but he was never anti-Christian. And he wasn't a big church member and church goer before the war, but he wasn't anti-Christian. And during the war, he invited chaplains to be with his officer staff and eat at their officers' mess. So he valued chaplains with his command. And one of his most prominent officers was a Methodist minister, D.C. Kelly. And he was a Methodist minister, and Major D.C. Kelly, early part of the war, when Forrest had to leave and go try to get supplies or meet with somebody at headquarters, he left Major Kelly in charge of his regiment or brigade, whatever he had at that time. And there's a story about after one of the battles, a column of federal prisoners were being taken to the rear, and Forrest noticed that one of them was a chaplain, and he told one of the guards, bring that man over here. And so they brought this chaplain over to Forrest, who was sitting there on his horse beside the road, and this chaplain was sweating blood because he had he'd remembered all these stories about Forrest and believed that Forrest was somehow a 2-headed monster and he was going to just rip him to pieces and drink his blood. And Forrest said, well, preacher, we'll send you back over to the federal lines when it's safe. He said, we'll send you over there under a flag of truce. We can't do it right now because there's still a lot of bullets flying around out there. And this man was just taken aback. And he said, I never believed I'd get such treatment. I believed all these stories about you. And I'm overwhelmed at your generosity. And he said, oh, yes, sir. When it's safe, we'll send you back. He said, the Yankees need you over there a lot more than we need you over here. So he had quite a few stories about him.
I bet.
That story. That one of the quotes was at that Parker's Crossroads battle down there in West Tennessee when they were coming out of Tennessee after that raid in December of '62. There was a federal force out in front of them, and Forrest was taking his time and using his artillery to take them out. He sent one of his commands back behind them. They knew another federal brigade was closing in on them from the rear, and they wanted them to stop them. They took the wrong road. And so the first warning they had, they heard shots behind them, and the horse holders were scattered and running. And one of them ran up to him and said, "General, we're surrounded. What are we going to do?" And he said, "Charge them both ways." And so that's what they did. They charged the unit to their front. They charged the unit to their rear. And I guess they were all West Point officers, where it says you have to have a 3-to-1 ratio to attack. So they figured if Forrest was attacking, they must be outnumbered 3-to-1. And as soon as they pulled back, he pulled his command together and got out of there. So charge them both ways. That'll take care of the situation.
Any closing thoughts?
Well, thank you very much for the time. And thank you very much for trying to present the correct information to our people out there. We have to have people like you in the media that try to get across the factual information of Forrest and the South and our war for Southern independence. It was not a war to maintain slavery. The South had offered to end slavery before the war and said, just do what the British did, pay the slave owners for their investment. And the same thing the French and the Spanish. Yep. Federal government refused to do it. It would have been a lot cheaper than fighting a war, and a lot more lives would have been saved.
Well, these were two slaveholding republics. At the time, they were two slave. I mean, you had slavery in the North at the same time. So,
yeah. And Lincoln's emancipation excluded the states in the North that slavery was still legal.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much. We appreciate the time and hope our viewers learned a little something about great Tennessee hero, Nathan Bedford Forrest.
Absolutely. Well, hey, I really appreciate what you do, and I appreciate you coming on and spending this time. And there's other things I wanted to get to, and I definitely want to have you back on. And we don't have to wait till his birthday next year. But I'll probably, if I'm doing this again next year, I'll probably do this again next year. But I don't want to wait a year to have you back on, because there's a lot of other ground I'd like to cover as well.
Thank you very much. Certainly will enjoy helping you out.
All right. Well, you have a great night. And once again, we really appreciate you. Maybe we can make Forrest great again.
Yes, sir. All right.
I want to thank the audience for taking the time to watch our program tonight. Please be sure to hit the like and subscribe button, as well as the notification bell, so you never miss an episode. We appreciate your support. Speaking of support, thanks again to Jonathan Mary League. Their donation makes July's programming possible. We really do appreciate that. Another way you can help us out is by subscribing. It doesn't cost anything, so please subscribe and share us with your friends as well. Check out our radio podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, and other platforms. Sign up for our weekly newsletters at our website, teeninformer.com, and follow us on Facebook and X. Look for Dave's Raves, which are 2-minute audio commentaries on current events. And no, I didn't do any last week, and I apologize, but we will have some out this week. Another feature coming soon will be called the Reptile Files, which will be an update on the dirty deals done to us, the citizens, by our legislators and other elected or appointed officials, state or federal. An announcement: the Constitutional Sheriff's Training online every Thursday in July at 7 p.m. Central. Know what your sheriff should know. Sign up at events.mamacat.org/Constitutional Sheriff's Training for citizens, or there is also a link on Tennessee Conservative News. Please be sure to join us for a second show this week on Thursday at 7 p.m. with Dr. Ken Berry. We'll be discussing a wide variety of topics from protein to politics. You don't want to miss this one. Next Monday, our special guest will be veteran and defender of our Constitution, Tom Davis, who will join us to explain why he intends to challenge incumbent Congressman Scott DesJarlais in 2026. We hope you can make it. That's it for now. Good night from Paris, Tennessee, that is. Hey.